Chapter 6. But the time was rapidly drawing near when I was to begin my second series of bouts with John Barleycorn. When I was 14, my head filled with the tales of the old voyagers, my mind with tropical isles and far sea rims, I was sailing a small centerboard skiff around San Francisco Bay and on the Oakland estuary. I wanted to go to sea. I wanted to get away from monotony and the commonplace. I was in the flower of my adolescence, athrill with romance and adventure, dreaming of wild life in the wild man world. Little I guessed how all the warp and woof of that man world was entangled with alcohol. So one day, as I hoisted sail on my skiff, I met Scotty. He was a husky youngster of 17, a runaway apprentice, he told me, from an English ship in Australia. He had just worked his way on another ship to San Francisco, and now he wanted to see about getting a berth on a whaler. Across the estuary, near where the whalers lay, was lying the sloop yacht Idler. The caretaker was a harpooner who intended sailing next voyage on the whale ship Bonanza. Would I take him, Scotty, over in my skiff to call upon the harpooner? Would I? Hadn't I heard the stories and rumours about the Idler? The big sloop that had come up from the Sandwich Islands where it had been engaged in smuggling opium. And the harpooner who was caretaker, how often had I seen him and envied him his freedom. He never had to leave the water. He slept aboard the Idler each night, while I had to go home upon the land to go to bed. The harpooner was only 19 years old, and I have never had anything but his own word that he was a harpooner. But he had been too shining and glorious a personality for me ever to address as I paddled around the yacht at a wistful distance. Would I take Scotty, the runaway sailor, to visit the harpooner on the opium smuggler Idler? Would I? The harpooner came on deck to answer our hail and invited us aboard. I played the sailor and the man, fending off the skiff so that it would not mar the yacht's white paint, dropping the skiff astern on a long painter and making the painter fast with two nonchalant half-hitches. We went below. It was the first sea interior I had ever seen. The clothing on the wall smelled musty, but what of that? Was it not the sea gear of men? Leather jackets lined with corduroy, blue coats of pilot cloth, sou'westers, sea boots, oilskins. And everywhere was in evidence the economy of space, the narrow bunks, the swinging tables, the incredible lockers. There were the telltale compass, the sea lamps in their gimbals, the blue-backed charts carelessly rolled and tucked away, the signal flags in alphabetical order, and a mariner's dividers jammed into the woodwork to hold a calendar. At last I was living. Here I sat, inside my first ship, a smuggler, accepted as a comrade by a harpooner and a runaway English sailor who said his name was Scotty. The first thing that the harpooner, aged 19, and the sailor, aged 17, did to show that they were men was to behave like men. The harpooner suggested the eminent desirableness of a drink, and Scotty searched his pockets for dimes and nickels. Then the harpooner carried away a pink flask to be filled in some blind pig, for there were no licensed saloons in that locality. We drank the cheap rotgut out of tumblers. Was I any the less strong, any the less valiant than the harpooner and the sailor? They were men. They proved it by the way they drank. Drink was the badge of manhood. So I drank with them, drink by drink, raw and straight, though the damned stuff couldn't compare with a stick of chewing taffy or a delectable cannonball. I shuddered and swallowed my gorge with every drink, though I manfully hid all such symptoms. Divers times we filled the flask that afternoon. All I had was 20 cents, but I put it up like a man, though with secret regret at the enormous store of candy it could have bought. The liquor mounted in the heads of all of us, and the talk of Scotty and the harpooner was upon running the easting down, gales off the Horn and pamperos off the Platte, lower topsail breezes, southerly busters, North Pacific gales, and of smashed whaleboats in the Arctic ice. "You can't swim in that ice water," said the harpooner confidentially to me. "You double up in a minute and go down. When a whale smashes your boat, the thing to do is to get your belly across an oar so that when the cold doubles you, you'll float." "Sure," I said, with a grateful nod and an air of certitude that I, too, would hunt whales and be in smashed boats in the Arctic Ocean. And truly, I registered his advice as singularly valuable information and filed it away in my brain where it persists to this day. But I couldn't talk at first. Heavens! I was only 14 and had never been on the ocean in my life. I could only listen to the two sea dogs and show my manhood by drinking with them, fairly and squarely, drink and drink. The liquor worked its will with me. The talk of Scotty and the harpooner poured through the pent space of the idler's cabin and through my brain with great gusts of wide, free wind. And in imagination I lived my years to come and rocked over the wild, mad, glorious world on multitudinous adventures. We unbent. Our inhibitions and taciturnities vanished. We were as if we had known each other for years and years, and we pledged ourselves to years of future voyagings together. The harpooner told of misadventures and secret shames. Scotty wept over his poor old mother in Edinburgh, a lady, he insisted, gently born, who was in reduced circumstances, who had pinched herself to pay the lump sum to the shipowners for his apprenticeship, whose sacrificing dream had been to see him a merchantman officer and a gentleman, and who was heartbroken because he had deserted his ship in Australia and joined another as a common sailor before the mast, and Scotty proved it. He drew her last sad letter from his pocket and wept over it as he read it aloud. The harpooner and I wept with him, and swore that all three of us would ship on the whale ship Bonanza, win a big payday, and still together make a pilgrimage to Edinburgh and lay our store of money in the dear lady's lap. And as John Barleycorn heated his way into my brain, thawing my reticence, melting my modesty, talking through me and with me and as me, my adopted twin brother and alter ego, I, too, raised my voice to show myself a man and an adventurer, and bragged in detail and at length of how I had crossed San Francisco Bay in my open skiff in a roaring sou'wester, even when the schooner sailors doubted my exploit. Further, I, or John Barleycorn, for it was the same thing, told Scotty that he might be a deep-sea sailor and know the last rope on the great deep-sea ships, but that when it came to small boat sailing, I could beat him hands down and sail circles around him. The best of it was that my assertion and brag were true. With reticence and modesty present, I could never have dared tell Scotty my small boat estimate of him. But it is ever the way of John Barleycorn to loosen the tongue and babble the secret thought. Scotty, or John Barleycorn, or the pair, was very naturally offended by my remarks. Nor was I loath. I could whip any runaway sailor 17 years old. Scotty and I flared and raged like young cockerels until the harpooner poured another round of drinks to enable us to forgive and make up, which we did, arms around each other's necks, protesting vows of eternal friendship, just like Black Matt and Tom Morrissey, I remembered, in the ranch kitchen in San Mateo. And remembering, I knew that I was at last a man, despite my meagre 14 years. A man as big and manly as those two strapping giants who had quarrelled and made up on that memorable Sunday morning of long ago. By this time, the singing stage was reached, and I joined Scotty and the harpooner in snatches of sea songs and shanties. It was here in the cabin of the Idler that I first heard Blow the Man Down, Flying Cloud, and Whiskey, Johnny Whiskey. Oh, it was brave. I was beginning to grasp the meaning of life. Here was no commonplace, no Oakland estuary, no weary round of throwing newspapers at front doors, delivering ice, and setting up ninepins. All the world was mine. All its paths were under my feet. And John Barleycorn, tricking my fancy, enabled me to anticipate the life of adventure for which I yearned. We were not ordinary. We were three tipsy young gods, incredibly wise, gloriously genial, and without limit to our powers. Ah, and I say it now after the years, could John Barleycorn keep one at such a height, I should never draw a sober breath again. But this is not a world of free freights. One pays according to an iron schedule. For every strength, the balanced weakness. For every high, a corresponding low. For every fictitious godlike moment, an equivalent time in reptilian slime. For every feat of telescoping long days and weeks of life into mad, magnificent instants, one must pay with shortened life and oft-times with savage usury added. Intenseness and duration are as ancient enemies as fire and water. They are mutually destructive. They cannot coexist. And John Barleycorn, mighty necromancer though he be, is as much a slave to organic chemistry as we mortals are. We pay for every nerve marathon we run. Nor can John Barleycorn intercede and fend off the just payment. He can lead us to the heights, but he cannot keep us there, else would we all be devotees. And there is no devotee but pays for the mad dances John Barleycorn pipes. Yet the foregoing is all in after wisdom spoken. It was no part of the knowledge of the lad, 14 years old, who sat in the idler's cabin between the harpooner and the sailor, the air rich in his nostrils with the musty smell of men's sea gear, roaring in chorus, "Yankee ship come down de river, pull, my bully boys, pull." We grew maudlin, and all talked and shouted at once. I had a splendid constitution, a stomach that would digest scrap iron, and I was still running my marathon in full vigour when Scotty began to fail and fade. His talk grew incoherent. He groped for words and could not find them, while the ones he found his lips were unable to form. His poisoned consciousness was leaving him. The brightness went out of his eyes, and he looked as stupid as were his efforts to talk. His face and body sagged as his consciousness sagged. A man cannot sit upright save by an act of will. Scotty's reeling brain could not control his muscles, and his correlations were breaking down. He strove to take another drink and feebly dropped the tumbler on the floor. Then, to my amazement, weeping bitterly, he rolled into a bunk on his back and immediately snored off to sleep. The harpooner and I drank on, grinning in a superior way to each other over Scotty's plight. The last flask was opened, and we drank it between us to the accompaniment of Scotty's stertorous breathing. Then the harpooner faded away into his bunk, and I was left alone, unthrown on the field of battle. I was very proud, and John Barleycorn was proud with me. I could carry my drink. I was a man. I had drunk 2 men, drink for drink, into unconsciousness. And I was still on my 2 feet, upright, making my way on deck to get air into my scorching lungs. It was in this bout on the Idler that I discovered what a good stomach and a strong head I had for drink. A bit of knowledge that was to be a source of pride in succeeding years, and that ultimately I was to come to consider a great affliction. The fortunate man is the one who cannot take more than a couple of drinks without becoming intoxicated. The unfortunate wight is the one who can take many glasses without betraying a sign, who must take numerous glasses in order to get the kick. The sun was setting when I came on the idler's deck. There were plenty of bunks below. I did not need to go home. But I wanted to demonstrate to myself how much I was a man. There lay my skiff astern. The last of a strong ebb was running out in channel in the teeth of an ocean breeze of 40 miles an hour. I could see the stiff white caps, and the suck and run of the current was plainly visible in the face and trough of each one. I set sail, cast off, took my place at the tiller, the sheet in my hand, and headed across channel. The skiff heeled over and plunged into it madly. The spray began to fly. I was at the pinnacle of exultation. I sang "Blow the Man Down" as I sailed. I was no boy of 14 living the mediocre ways of the sleepy town called Oakland. I was a man, a god, and the very elements rendered me allegiance as I bidded them to my will. The tide was out. A full 100 yards of soft mud intervened between the boat wharf and the water. I pulled up my centreboard, ran full tilt into the mud, took in sail, and standing in the stern, as I had often done at low tide, I began to shove the skiff with an oar. It was then that my correlations began to break down. I lost my balance and pitched head foremost into the ooze. Then, and for the first time, as I floundered to my feet, covered with slime, the blood running down my arms from a scrape against a barnacled stake, I knew that I was drunk. But what of it? Across the channel, 2 strong sailormen lay unconscious in their bunks where I had drunk them. I was a man. I was still on my legs, if they were knee-deep in mud. I disdained to get back into the skiff. I waded through the mud, shoving the skiff before me and yammering the chant of my manhood to the world. I paid for it. I was sick for a couple of days, meanly sick, and my arms were painfully poisoned from the barnacle scratches. For a week I could not use them, and it was a torture to put on and take off my clothes. I swore, never again. The game wasn't worth it. The price was too stiff. I had no moral qualms. My revulsion was purely physical. No exalted moments were worth such hours of misery and wretchedness. When I got back to my skiff, I shunned the idler. I would cross the opposite side of the channel to go around her. Scotty had disappeared. The harpooner was still about, but him I avoided. Once, when he landed on the boat wharf, I hid in a shed so as to escape seeing him. I was afraid he would propose some more drinking, maybe have a flask full of whiskey in his pocket. And yet, and here enters the necromancy of John Barleycorn, That afternoon's drunk on the Idler had been a purple passage flung into the monotony of my days. It was memorable. My mind dwelt on it continually. I went over the details, over and over again. Among other things, I had got into the cogs and springs of men's actions. I had seen Scotty weep about his own worthlessness and the sad case of his Edinburgh mother who was a lady. The harpooner had told me terribly wonderful things of himself. I had caught a myriad enticing and inflammatory hints of a world beyond my world, and for which I was certainly as fitted as the two lads who had drunk with me. I had got behind men's souls. I had got behind my own soul and found unguessed potencies and greatnesses. Yes, that day stood out above all my other days. To this day it so stands out. The memory of it is branded in my brain. But the price exacted was too high. I refused to play and pay and returned to my cannonballs and taffy slabs. The point is that all the chemistry of my healthy, normal body drove me away from alcohol. The stuff didn't agree with me. It was abominable. But despite this, circumstance was to continue to drive me toward John Barleycorn, to drive me again and again until, after long years, the time should come when I would look upon John Barleycorn in every haunt of men, look him up and hail him gladly as benefactor and friend, and detest and hate him all the time. Yes, he is a strange friend, John Barleycorn. End of chapter 6.